The eagle-eyed amongst you may have spotted that there's been a boatload of remasters or remakes popping up left, right and centre on various digital distribution platforms over the past few years. These have garnered varying responses, ranging from "this is the definitive edition of this piece of art and is what it should have been in the first place" to "oh god, what have they done to my childhood?" In the world of gaming, the idea of taking a previous piece of work and giving it a lick of paint isn't a new concept, as it's been happening for about 45 years under a different name. Conversion. A magical sounding word that conjures up images of vast reams of code and a hunchbacked recluse typing at a terminal. Way back when, you had a plethora of different systems with different architectures. The problem was that their fragmented user base all wanted the same titles, so the publishers either had the developers remake the game themselves, or farmed out the conversion to another studio with varying results. This is how a lot of great people got their first gigs in the business, by converting one set of programming operations into another that somehow functioned within the confines of an entirely different system. On occasion, titles were even better than the original, offering graphical improvements or new gameplay features entirely. The people responsible would then make games about trains or orcs and become massively wealthy. Nowadays, most personal computing has been standardized into IBM compatibles with similar architecture. The mobile world has largely settled into two camps with ARM processors, and most of the consoles are also glorified PCs these days. This, combined with new software tools, makes it easier than ever before to port titles to other systems and reap the benefits financially by appealing to as broad a clientele as possible. The Wikipedia entry on remakes is a minefield of citation needed, so this is very much an opinion piece from yours truly. They claim that proper remakes as opposed to ports were being made as early as 1986 with the likes of the first Ultima, but the line between conversion, port, remaster and remake is very blurry indeed. A conversion for me is taking the original gameplay concepts and often the graphics and or source code of the game and making it run on a different system. This term can be used interchangeably with port, as they're the same thing in my mind. A remaster is taking that original game and improving the assets and or gameplay, so that it falls in line with modern sensibilities, often for the same system it originated on. A remake is ignoring the code of the game entirely and recreating almost everything from scratch. Simple stuff, yeah? While it isn't that cut and dry, it'll suffice for the purposes of this video. Sure, there might not be much of a difference between these two Ultima titles to the naked eye, but they feature entirely different code bases under the hood. Might and Magic 2 is a great example of more obvious graphical differences. It was released on 12 different systems over the course of 5 years. Eat your heart out, Skyrim. I'm not going to display a slideshow of all 12 because Moby Games doesn't have the right screenshots, and I've not descended into the depths of insanity so far that I want to play 12 different versions of the same game. Instead, here's an entirely randomly selected image that 5 different versions sported proudly in their screenshots for some reason. They're all roughly the same game, with a few differences with regards to gameplay and interface. But it's a good example of how much the end product can change when given to entirely different teams. When CD-ROM drives and multimedia PCs became a thing in the early 90s, developers went from having a few megabytes of storage to pack things on to having hundreds on optical media, and fancy sound cards to play it through. This led to some of my favourite games being upgraded with fully voiced characters and better graphics.
Well, you're talking to the right person. My troop specializes in spice prospecting. I'm sure we're the only Freeman troop who are able to do this.
These enhanced CD versions were remasters of a sort, improving game assets and bringing outdated titles up to contemporaneous standards. So we've established that remasters are a thing that's been happening for a very long time. So what's that got to do with the sudden increase lately? Nostalgia! The children these companies sold their product to years ago are now adults suffering through modern society. and any excuse to flog a return to the glory days so they can ignore the current hellscape will be readily accepted. No need to gamble on a new intellectual property when you can just take a game people know is good and repackage it with better graphics and sound. Essentially, they're making the title look and play as well or better than your nostalgia goggles remember it being. The laziest version of these are the modern console ports. The original assets had been downscaled or downsampled to save space. Let's take those and leave them uncompressed. Take the engine and uncap the frame rate, then have it display at a higher resolution and slap on a few new assets, so you can sell it to a person who has already bought the original release. It should be pointed out that the actual porting of code from one architecture to another is still a thing on many of these next generation upgrades. That's the hard work, and many of them are remakes and entirely new engines instead, with a substantial amount of additional assets and gameplay elements. Again, not an easy task and one that should be praised. While bleeding intellectual property dry for the sake of nostalgia and a quick buck is nothing new, the difference here is there's now confirmation bias involved. The people purchasing the game have generally played it before and know that it's good. All you have to do as a developer is make sure it's functional and pretty. A much easier task creatively than launching something new and exciting. Except for one glaring issue. It turns out that a lot of people doing the remastering either aren't up to the task, or get strange notions of their own brought about either by pressure from above or delusions of grandeur. For some of these people it's just another job. They've not played the original and don't have any memories of what it should be like. For others it's a misguided belief that because the title is old, they'll need to fix some things that don't need to be fixed. And when it goes wrong, oh boy does it go wrong. A half-baked game is generally forgotten about by everyone except the niche audiences of weird video reviewers on YouTube. A half-baked version of a game that was universally adored before? Get the pitchforks! It's murdering time! The state of many of these remasters is also the reason that there's so many in this modern age. The games industry is a bloated behemoth, struggling for breath under the weight of billion-dollar expectations. The more money involved, the less risk the company will take. A steady upward trend in their profits is far better than gambling it all away because of too much ambition. A product with a recognizable name and passable gameplay is far more viable in this climate than a brand new offering that requires its audience to think, and market forces dictate that certain genres will receive far more titles than others now, especially if that particular genre required any kind of budget to create. Now, with all but a few new ideas that the gaming industry has being quashed or released as indie titles after being foiled by the increasingly corporate structure stifling creative endeavour, the only recourse left to big companies is polishing up their previous triumphs and trying to ride the nostalgia wave. It's a desperate attempt to capture a jaded audience who aren't happy with the bland new titles being shoveled out after being focus grouped to death. And that is why there's so many remasters. Because even when they're trying to make exactly what they used to, they can't make them like they used to.